In the dead silence of a humid summer night, as the cicadas droned in the distance and the soft glow of my desk lamp carved shadows on the walls, I stumbled upon a truth so searing that it threatened to rip apart my very soul. A single, grainy video clip, recorded by a spy cam I'd secretly installed, revealed everything, the unmistakable, horrifying evidence that my wife was cheating. In those first 100 heart-stopping words, I learned that the perfect life I had built was nothing but a brittle illusion, and the pain of betrayal would soon come crashing down in the worst way imaginable. I had always prided myself on the unspoken trust that defined my marriage and the unwavering support of my family. My wife, Lisa, was the epitome of grace and devotion, or so I believed. For years, my relatives had celebrated our seemingly unblemished union, praising our shared values and our commitment to one another. They dismissed any whisper of doubt as baseless and naive, insisting that love could conquer all and that no one could ever betray a bond as sacred as ours. I, too, clung to that comforting narrative, until one fateful night shattered every illusion. It all began with a nagging unease, a feeling that something was amiss. At first, it was subtle, a late return from an extra shift, a hushed tone on the phone, a fleeting glance that darted away when I entered the room. I tried to ignore these small anomalies, chalking them up to the stresses of modern life. Yet, deep inside, a seed of suspicion took root, growing slowly until it could no longer be contained. One sleepless night, driven by a desperate need to understand the truth, I made a decision that would change everything. I installed a discreet spy cam in our living room, convinced that if any infidelity were to occur, I would catch it on tape. The days that followed were agonizingly ordinary. I maintained my routines with a feigned normalcy, all the while haunted by the silent promise of proof hidden in plain sight. I didn't tell a soul, not my best friend, not even a trusted family member, about my covert investigation. I was determined to handle this betrayal quietly, to confront it with undeniable evidence rather than baseless accusations. After all, my family had always dismissed my concerns about Lisa's behavior. They believed our love was too strong to be undermined by a stray flirtation or a momentary lapse. They had even laughed at my previous, timid hints that something might be off, calling it paranoia and exaggeration. But as the spy cam's memory filled silently in the dark of our home, my doubts began to crystallize into a terrifying reality. It was late on a humid Thursday when I finally decided to review the footage. I sat at my computer, the soft hum of the hard drive echoing in the quiet of the night, and hesitated for a moment before clicking play. My heart hammered in my chest as I watched, frozen, the grainy images flicker on the screen. There she was, Lisa, in the soft light of our living room, engaged in a tender, unmistakable embrace with a man I had never seen before. The camera's angle captured every secret detail, the way their bodies moved together with a familiarity that was all too intimate, the soft, muffled laughter that punctuated their whispered conversation, and the stolen kisses that spoke volumes of a passion I had been blissfully unaware of. My breath caught in my throat, and a cold dread seeped into my bones. I replayed the clip over and over, unable to tear my eyes away. Each viewing was a fresh agony, a confirmation of a betrayal I had long feared but desperately hoped wasn't true. The images were raw and unedited, a damning testament to a life of deception. As I sat there, the evidence burning into my mind, a part of me shattered. The perfect marriage, the unwavering love I had once taken for granted, was nothing more than a carefully maintained lie. The days following that revelation became a surreal haze of disbelief and silent torment. I moved through my routine with a haunted expression, every familiar face and conversation now tinted with the bitterness of betrayal. At family gatherings, I wore a mask of normalcy, smiling at relatives who marveled at the supposed perfection of my life, while inside I seethed with a private, consuming pain. Their disbelief in my suspicions, their unwavering faith in the sanctity of my marriage, only deepened my isolation. I became a man burdened with a secret so heavy that every moment felt like a battle between maintaining appearances and confronting the overwhelming truth. I wrestled with a torrent of emotions, anger, sorrow, humiliation, and a relentless desire for retribution. I kept the footage locked away on my computer, a silent witness to the unraveling of a life I once cherished. Every night, as I lay in bed in a state of restless anguish, I replayed the images in my mind. I began to question every smile, every gentle touch that I had once believed was genuine. The betrayal wasn't a single, explosive moment. It was a slow, corrosive process that had eroded the very foundation of our trust. In my desperation for understanding, I scoured our past for clues I might have overlooked. I remembered the small, almost imperceptible changes in Lisa's behavior, the way she'd sometimes glance away when I asked about her day, the sudden trips that she explained away with vague references to work, and the inexplicable delays in her responses to my questions. Each recollection became a painful puzzle piece that, when assembled, painted a damning portrait of a woman I thought I knew. I questioned every conversation, every moment of intimacy, trying to reconcile the image of the loving wife with the reality captured on the spy cam. At work, I found it increasingly difficult to focus. The persistent echo of the footage haunted me like a ghost, distracting me from daily tasks and turning even the most mundane moments into a silent indictment of my shattered life. I began to withdraw from colleagues and friends, unable to share the deep betrayal that had ripped through my heart. I kept my turmoil hidden behind a veneer of calm professionalism, even as the burden of the truth weighed me down like a millstone. Each day was a delicate balancing act, maintaining a semblance of normalcy in public while drowning in private despair. I turned to my journal as an outlet for the raw emotions swirling inside me. Night after night, I poured out the details of my discovery and the ensuing agony, recording every fragment of my pain with brutal honesty. I wrote about the fateful moment I watched the spy cam footage, the way my heart had nearly stopped, and the overwhelming sense of betrayal that had consumed me. The pages of my journal became a confessional, a space where I could confront the magnitude of my loss and try to make sense of the pieces of my broken life. In those long, solitary hours, I also wrestled with a burning question. How could my family, the very people who had always believed in the sanctity of our marriage, be so dismissive of my doubts? They had laughed off my concerns, insisting that I was overreacting, that our love was too strong to be undermined by a mere rumor. Their unwavering belief in the perfection of our union made the evidence even more bitter, for it underscored the loneliness of my discovery. I felt isolated not only by the betrayal itself but by the chasm between my private anguish and the public facade of marital bliss that everyone else seemed to cherish. As the days bled into weeks, I became consumed with a need for resolution, a desperate urge to confront Lisa and demand an explanation that could either shatter or, somehow, mend what remained of our relationship. The thought of a direct confrontation filled me with a mix of dread and determination. I rehearsed potential conversations in my head, imagining the myriad ways she might respond to the evidence I had gathered. Would she deny everything, offering feeble excuses that would only confirm my worst fears? Or would she, in a moment of vulnerability, confess to the betrayal that had upended our lives? The uncertainty was unbearable, a constant pressure that gnawed at me day and night. In a final act of desperation, I decided that I could no longer keep this secret locked away. I would confront her with the undeniable truth, no matter the cost. I spent countless hours preparing for that conversation, reviewing every piece of evidence, every snapshot and message that documented her hidden affair. I arranged the printed screenshots, the spy cam footage, and the annotated logs on a table, creating a visual testament to the betrayal that had so irrevocably altered my world. Each piece of evidence was a shard of a once perfect mirror, now fractured beyond repair. And so, on a chilly evening when the wind howled outside and the sky was a sullen gray, I invited her to join me in our living room. My heart pounded in my ears as I sat her down, the silent tension between us thick enough to cut with a knife. I took a deep, trembling breath and began to speak, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. I said nothing of anger, only the quiet, relentless truth that had been captured in every frame of evidence. I explained, word by painful word, what I had seen, what I had gathered, and what it meant for the perfect life we had once shared. The look in her eyes was the first sign of the collapse. Shock, guilt, and a profound sorrow mingled in her gaze, a silent acknowledgement of a truth that she could no longer hide. The conversation that followed was a painful unraveling of years of intimacy and trust, each word a dagger that drove deeper into the heart of our marriage. She tried to offer explanations, to minimize the betrayal, but the evidence was irrefutable. The group chat, the spy cam footage, every detail was laid bare before her, exposing the hidden life that I had discovered. In that moment, as the silence between us grew unbearable, I realized that nothing would ever be the same. The perfect marriage I had believed in had crumbled under the weight of a secret that was now impossible to ignore. My world, once filled with the gentle rhythms of shared love, had been shattered into irreparable fragments. And as the tears began to fall from her eyes, I knew that the journey ahead would be one of painful reckoning, a journey where the truth, however brutal, would force us both to confront the cost of our choices. That confrontation marked the beginning of a new, uncertain chapter in my life. I no longer had the luxury of ignorance, I was now bound to the relentless reality of betrayal. As I watched the evidence lay between us, a quiet resolve took root in my heart, a determination to reclaim my identity, to rebuild from the ruins of what had once been, and to find a path forward even in the midst of unspeakable pain. The spy cam had captured more than just moments of infidelity. It had exposed the fragile underbelly of a marriage that I had once believed was unbreakable. And in that exposure, I was forced to confront not only the actions of the one I loved but also the silent betrayals of my own misplaced trust. In the days that followed, as the echoes of that painful confrontation reverberated through the empty corridors of our home, I began to understand that the path to healing would be long and arduous. The evidence of her betrayal, though devastating, was also a catalyst, a painful but necessary spark that forced me to question everything I thought I knew about love, trust, and the very nature of human connection. With each passing moment, I realized that the truth, no matter how shattering, was the only way to reclaim my dignity and rebuild a life defined not by illusions, but by unvarnished reality. And so, standing on the precipice of a future forever altered, I vowed to take that painful truth and transform it into a new beginning. I resolved to rebuild my world from the fragments of betrayal, to learn from the scars that would forever mark my heart, and to forge a path toward a life where the truth, no matter how bitter, would set me free. As the rain subsided and the first timid rays of dawn broke through the gray skies, I stepped forward with a heavy, yet determined heart, ready to face whatever the future might hold. In the days following the discovery, my every waking moment became a relentless tug-of-war between the urge to confront and the need to preserve a semblance of control. Outwardly, I maintained a carefully constructed facade of calm, a nod here, a measured word there, but inside, I was a storm of raw emotion. I retreated into solitude, poring over every screenshot and timestamp I had saved from that group chat, each digital artifact a relentless reminder of the betrayal. My mind raced with memories of happier times, the soft laughter shared over dinner, the whispered plans for the future, all of which now clashed bitterly with the mocking messages of a woman I thought I knew. I spent countless hours in the quiet of our study, rereading the incriminating messages. Every boastful quip and explicit emoji burned itself into my memory. I could hardly believe that Amanda, my loving wife of 10 years, had so casually broadcast her affair to friends and acquaintances, as if it were nothing more than idle gossip. The more I reread those messages, the more I noticed details that I had once ignored. The playful arrogance in her tone, the dismissive laugh when others questioned the reality of the affair, and the way she seemed to revel in the thrill of secrecy. It was a mosaic of deception that forced me to confront a painful truth. My trust had been violated not in a moment of explosive passion, but in a slow, accumulating disregard for our sacred bond. The silence in our home became unbearable. Each day, I observed Amanda with a detached curiosity, a silent archivist of our disintegrating life. I noticed the way her eyes would wander to her phone as if it held a world she no longer wished to share with me, and the subtle tightening of her smile whenever I broached the subject of our weekend plans. My heart ached with every silent, calculated gesture that betrayed her hidden life. I began to document these changes in a leather-bound journal, noting the times and details with an almost clinical precision. Every entry served as both a record and a personal indictment, a tally of the cracks that had long undermined our marriage. Even as I meticulously gathered this evidence, I struggled with a haunting internal question: how had I missed the signals? I racked my brain, replaying old conversations and analyzing every nuance of her tone, wondering if I had been blinded by my own devotion. The realization was devastating. I had built my identity around the belief in our unshakable bond, and now that foundation was crumbling beneath the weight of secrets. Each memory, once filled with warmth, now stung with the bitter taste of betrayal. I felt isolated not only from her but also from the world I thought we shared, a world that now seemed as fragile and illusory as a house of cards. I decided that a confrontation was inevitable, a moment when I could no longer hide behind silence. Yet, I wasn't sure if I was ready to unleash the full fury of my emotions, or if I should continue to let the evidence build until it was impossible to deny. I vacillated between the desire for a quiet, controlled revelation and the urge to confront her in a blaze of indignation. In the solitude of long, sleepless nights, I rehearsed possible dialogues in my head, imagining her reaction, her voice trembling with shock, perhaps remorse, or even anger. I needed to understand her motivations. Was it a momentary lapse, or had she been living a double life for years? I reached out to an old friend, Daniel, who had known me since before our marriage had taken on its perfect veneer. Over a late-night phone call, I confided in him, my voice thick with unshed tears and uncertainty. "I found messages, Daniel," I said quietly, boasting about an affair. I never thought it would be like this." Daniel's silence on the other end spoke volumes. I could hear his steady breathing, and then he replied, "You deserve the truth, no matter how painful it is." Remember, you built your life on trust. If that's gone, you must rebuild on something real. His words, gentle yet resolute, helped me steel myself for the confrontation that loomed ahead. Emboldened by that conversation, I made the decision to act. I printed out every screenshot, every piece of evidence from that group chat, and organized them in chronological order. I even compiled a detailed timeline, noting when each message had been sent, the context in which it appeared, and any peculiarities in tone that hinted at more than just casual flirting. The dossier that emerged was damning, a clear, unassailable record of Amanda's betrayal. I rehearsed in front of a mirror for hours, trying to find the right balance of calmness and assertiveness for when I would confront her. I didn't want to be overcome with rage. I needed to remain in control, to let the evidence speak for itself. The day I had chosen for the confrontation dawned gray and overcast, a fitting mirror to my inner turmoil. I had arranged for a quiet dinner at home, knowing that our intimate setting would leave no room for public embarrassment or rash decisions. I sat at the table with the dossier neatly spread out before me, my heart pounding with a mixture of dread and grim determination. Amanda arrived home a bit later than usual that evening, and as she entered the living room, I could see a flicker of surprise in her eyes when she noticed the papers laid out so deliberately. "Amanda," I began, my voice steady but my heart pounding wildly, "we need to talk." I gestured for her to sit down, and with a trembling hand, I slid the first page of the dossier across the table. It was a screenshot of the group chat, the bold, unfiltered words a stark contrast to the hushed tones I had once believed were reserved for our most intimate moments. For a long, painful minute, silence reigned. Her eyes darted across the printed messages, and I could see the color draining from her face. She tried to speak, her voice soft and uncertain, but I pressed on. "I've seen these messages, Amanda. I know about the affair. I trusted you with my life, and now I'm left to wonder what else has been hidden." Her response was a choked murmur of denial at first, a desperate attempt to cling to the remnants of our shared life. But as I methodically presented each piece of evidence, the timeline of secret outings, the contradictory explanations, the undeniable digital trail, she could no longer maintain the facade. Her eyes filled with tears as she finally admitted, in a whisper, that the affair had been ongoing, that it wasn't just a fleeting lapse but a prolonged betrayal that had been woven into the fabric of our life without my knowledge. The confession hit me like a wave of bitter inevitability. I felt a profound sadness, a mourning for the love and trust we had once shared. At the same time, a cold resolve settled within me, a determination to no longer be a victim of silence. I asked her for every detail, every reason behind the betrayal, wanting to understand how we had drifted so far apart. She hesitated, then spoke haltingly about feeling neglected, of yearning for the excitement that our stable life could no longer provide. Her words, though remorseful, were laced with an indifference that stung more than any overt act of deception. I realized then that the perfect marriage we had built was nothing more than a carefully maintained illusion, a fragile facade that had crumbled under the weight of unspoken desires. That night, as we sat in a silence thick with regret and despair, I felt the enormity of the truth settle in. My world, my very identity, was irreparably altered. The betrayal wasn't merely about the physical act of infidelity, it was the shattering of the sacred trust one had so blindly cherished. I saw in her tear-streaked face the stark reality that our life together had been nothing but a mirage, and that I had been left to wander in a desert of broken promises. In the days that followed, the fallout rippled through every corner of our lives. Friends and family, once blissfully ignorant of the undercurrents in our relationship, began to sense that something was irrevocably broken. The scandal of her public boasting in that group chat spread quietly at first, then exploded in whispers and raised eyebrows. I was left to contend with the painful realization that not only had my trust been violated, but that the very foundation of our social world, built on the belief in the sanctity of marriage, had been shattered. I retreated into solitude, haunted by the memory of her confession and the evidence of her betrayal. My days became a montage of bitter introspection and silent resolve. I revisited every moment we had shared, every laugh and every touch, now tinted with the pallor of deceit. I questioned how I had allowed our perfect life to slip through my fingers, and whether I could ever rebuild a trust that had been so brutally undermined. Yet, amid the overwhelming sorrow and anger, a small, stubborn spark of hope began to glow. I realized that while the truth had exposed the fragility of our marriage, it also offered a chance to reclaim myself, to rebuild my identity from the ruins of betrayal. I started to seek therapy, joining a support group where others shared similar stories of loss and redemption. In those spaces, I found solace in knowing that I wasn't alone, that many had walked the dark path of betrayal and emerged, scarred but wiser, with a renewed sense of self. I began to take small steps toward healing. I returned to old hobbies, long walks at dusk, quiet afternoons reading in a sunlit park, even the tentative strumming of my guitar, and allowed the simple joys of life to gradually fill the void left by shattered trust. I made a promise to myself that I would not let this betrayal define me entirely. Instead, I would honor the lessons learned and strive to rebuild a life based on authenticity and resilience. The process was neither quick nor easy. There were nights when the pain was almost too overwhelming, when I would stare into the darkness and wonder if I would ever find a way out of the labyrinth of loss. But with each passing day, as I faced the truth head-on, I began to see that the scars of betrayal were not marks of defeat, they were emblems of survival. The journey of healing, I realized, was about embracing the full spectrum of emotions, allowing both the agony and the hope to coexist, and eventually, using that raw, unfiltered truth to forge a new path forward. Now, as I write these words in the quiet solitude of my study, I am still haunted by the memory of that fateful confrontation, the day when the undeniable evidence of betrayal lay exposed, and my perfect world crumbled into a mosaic of shattered dreams. Yet, in the aftermath, I have discovered a profound, unyielding strength within myself. I have learned that truth, however painful, is the first step toward liberation. I have come to understand that while trust, once broken, can never be fully restored, it can be rebuilt anew on a foundation of honest introspection and self-forgiveness. As I look toward the future, I do so with cautious optimism. The road ahead is uncertain, paved with the remnants of a love that once was and the fragile promise of renewal. I know that the journey to reclaim my identity from the ruins of betrayal will be long and arduous, but I am determined to walk it, step by painful step, until I find that elusive light at the end of the tunnel. This is not the end of my story, but merely a turning point. I am emerging from the shadows of a perfect lie into the raw, honest light of a truth that has set me free. And though the pain of betrayal will always linger like a distant echo, I now embrace it as part of the tapestry of my life, a reminder that even when the world around us crumbles, the human spirit has the capacity to rise, rebuild, and ultimately, rediscover the beauty in truth. In the cold light of an early morning that felt as if it were born from the ashes of a shattered dream, I finally realized that nothing could ever restore the perfect illusion of what I once believed our marriage to be. The group chat, those brazen, unapologetic messages where my wife, Lisa, boasted about her affair, had become the fulcrum on which my entire world pivoted. Every single word, every emoji, every snide remark etched into that digital conversation was a declaration of betrayal that I had been forced to live with. And now, as the full force of the fallout pressed in around me, I was left to face the consequences of exposing the truth in the worst way imaginable. That day, after my public exposure of her affair spread like wildfire across social media and local gossip columns, the weight of the scandal transformed our home into a mausoleum of broken promises. Family members who had once celebrated our seemingly unblemished union now offered me sympathetic glances laced with pity and shock. Friends, too, whispered behind my back, their voices tinged with disbelief at the cruelty of a secret so brazenly shared. I sat alone at the dinner table that evening, the evidence of her betrayal still spread out before me, a damning dossier of screenshots, timestamps, and candid confessions. It was as if every pixel of that digital record screamed out the truth, that the person I loved had chosen to flaunt our private ruin to the world. I remember the moment I logged onto the news website and saw the headline splashed across the screen, "Cheating wife brags affair in group chat, husband exposes all." My pulse raced, and for a long minute, I was numb. I felt exposed, vulnerable, yet at the same time, oddly liberated. The truth, however brutal, was no longer mine alone to bear. It was out in the open, a public testament to the fallibility of trust. But that exposure came at a terrible price. Lisa's life, once so carefully curated and admired by our close-knit community, was now in ruins. Her social circle fractured, her colleagues whispered and avoided her gaze, even our parents, who had once congratulated us on our perfect union, now looked upon her with a mixture of sorrow and disapproval. In the days that followed, our home became a battlefield of unspoken words and heavy silences. Lisa withdrew into herself, avoiding eye contact, her once vibrant presence reduced to a ghost drifting through empty rooms. I, too, became a shadow of the man I once was, a man who had believed in unwavering love and a life of shared joy. Instead, I found myself grappling with a cascade of emotions, a profound sadness for the dreams we had lost, a simmering anger that burned at the edges of my consciousness, and an overwhelming sense of betrayal that seeped into every corner of my being. I spent long hours alone in the study, rereading my journal entries and staring at the printed evidence with a mixture of triumph and regret. Each screenshot, each carefully preserved message, was a reminder not only of her infidelity but of the life we had built together. A life that, in hindsight, seemed built on a foundation of mutual neglect as much as it was on love. I began to question myself. Had I ignored the subtle signs for too long? Was my own complacency partly to blame for the chasm that had opened between us? The answers eluded me, lost in the overwhelming tide of my emotions. In the midst of this personal devastation, I also had to contend with the relentless public scrutiny. The media frenzy had not only exposed Lisa's betrayal to the world but had also thrust me into an unwanted spotlight. I was invited to speak on local news segments, asked to give interviews, and even faced accusatory questions from acquaintances who once admired our marriage. At first, I relished the idea of vindication, a chance to show the world that I was not a naive fool, but a man who had unearthed the truth. Yet, as the days wore on, I began to feel that this public exposure was a double-edged sword. The more I spoke, the more I realized that my pain was now not only my own but a spectacle for others. The stares of pity, the hushed conversations, and the relentless questions began to erode the part of me that still longed for privacy, for the ability to grieve in silence. In that tumultuous period, I sought refuge in therapy. I began attending sessions with a counselor who specialized in marital betrayal. Our conversations were raw and unvarnished, filled with the kind of brutal honesty that I had long suppressed. Through these sessions, I slowly learned that while exposing Lisa's infidelity had given me a measure of control over the narrative, it did not mend the broken pieces of my heart. I had to confront not only the external devastation of our unraveling life but also the internal fallout of shattered trust. My therapist helped me see that healing was not about erasing the past, but about integrating it into a new, more resilient sense of self. The truth can set you free, she told me gently, but only if you learn to forgive, not for the other person's sake, but for your own. Her words resonated deep within me, stirring a flicker of hope amid the pervasive sorrow. Slowly, I began to rebuild my life from the ruins. I took to long walks in the early mornings, letting the quiet beauty of a new day wash over me and remind me that, even in the aftermath of betrayal, there was still beauty to be found. I reconnected with old friends, people who remembered me not as the husband who had been betrayed, but as the man who once dreamed of a future filled with promise and possibility. Their support was a balm to my wounded spirit, a reminder that I was not defined solely by the events of that painful night. I also returned to my writing, a passion I had abandoned in the whirlwind of our earlier life together. I poured my heart onto paper, channeling the raw agony and the bittersweet glimmers of hope into essays and poems that spoke of loss, betrayal, and ultimately, redemption. Each word was a step on the long road to healing, a testament to the fact that, even when everything you once held dear crumbles, you still have the power to forge a new beginning. There were, of course, days when the pain was overwhelming. I would wake in the middle of the night, heart pounding, and feel the sting of every tear shed over a lost dream. I grappled with memories of a marriage that had once been a fortress of trust, now reduced to echoes of deceit. But even in those darkest moments, I clung to the belief that truth, no matter how brutal, was the foundation for renewal. I slowly learned to accept that I could not change the past, but I could shape my future. One crisp spring afternoon, I found myself at a small park, watching children play and families share quiet moments of joy. The scene stirred something within me, a realization that life, despite its betrayals and heartbreak, continued to move forward. I sat on a worn bench, the warmth of the sun on my face a gentle reminder that every ending was also a beginning. In that moment, I resolved that I would no longer let the scars of betrayal dictate my existence. I would embrace the lessons of my pain and let them guide me toward a future where trust, though perhaps different from what I once knew, could be rebuilt anew. The process of rebuilding was neither linear nor swift. There were setbacks, days when the memories would resurface with a vengeance, when the pain felt unbearable and the world seemed to be shrouded in darkness. But slowly, with each new sunrise, I found that the bitterness began to recede, replaced by a cautious optimism that whispered of new possibilities. I started to set small goals for myself, simple acts of self-care, moments of genuine connection with those who cared for me, and even attempts to forgive the past. I realized that forgiveness was not about condoning the betrayal, but about freeing myself from the heavy chains of endless resentment. In time, I began to see that the public exposure of Lisa's affair, as harsh as it had been, had also opened the door to honest reflection. I was no longer the man who lived in the shadow of deceit. I was emerging as someone who could confront his own vulnerabilities and learn from the heartbreak. The process was painful, a slow, sometimes agonizing transformation, but it was also liberating. I discovered a strength within me that I hadn't known existed, a quiet resilience that carried me through the long, lonely nights and the bitter days that followed. I started to rebuild relationships that had been strained by the scandal. I reconnected with family members who had once offered their unconditional support, and I allowed myself to be vulnerable once more, sharing my story with others who had endured similar betrayals. In those moments of shared understanding, I found that I was not alone in my suffering. The collective pain of many hearts had a way of healing, of slowly mending the broken pieces through compassion and empathy. One evening, as I sat by the window watching the golden hues of sunset, I reflected on the journey that had led me to this point. I remembered the shock of that fateful night, the relentless investigation that had uncovered the hidden digital confessions, and the painful confrontation that had exposed our crumbling marriage to the world. And now, amidst the quiet twilight, I saw the glimmer of a new beginning. The scars of betrayal remained, etched into my memory like silent testaments to a past I could not erase, but they no longer defined me. Instead, they had become the building blocks of a renewed identity, one forged from the raw, unfiltered truth and tempered by the gentle promise of forgiveness. I took a deep breath, feeling the cool evening air fill my lungs, and allowed myself a small, tentative smile. The journey ahead was uncertain, and the path to complete healing was still long and winding. Yet, I now understood that every step I took, every act of self-compassion, every moment of genuine connection, was a victory over the darkness of betrayal. I resolved to continue forward with courage, to embrace each new day as a chance to redefine what love, trust, and forgiveness meant to me. In the end, the exposure of Lisa's affair, as brutal and public as it had been, had forced me to confront the very essence of my identity. It had shattered the perfect illusion of our marriage, leaving me to pick up the pieces of a life once built on trust. But in that shattering, I also found the seeds of renewal, a painful but necessary catalyst that set me on the path to rediscovery. I learned that the truth, no matter how devastating, carries within it the power to liberate and transform. And while the memories of that dark chapter will always linger, they no longer cast me into despair. Instead, they serve as a reminder that even when everything you thought was perfect crumbles away, you have the strength to rebuild, to forgive, and ultimately, to find hope in the quiet promise of tomorrow. As I stand on the threshold of a future that remains unwritten, I choose to step forward with the knowledge that I am stronger than the betrayal that once threatened to break me. I embrace the scars as symbols of survival and resilience, and I move onward with a cautious optimism that whispers of new beginnings. My heart, though forever marked by the pain of deception, beats with a renewed determination to live authentically, to seek love and trust on my own terms, tempered by the hard-won wisdom of the past. This is my rebirth, a journey from the depths of exposure and humiliation to the tender, hopeful dawn of self-discovery. I have learned that true strength is not in the silence of revenge, but in the courage to face the truth and, in doing so, to reclaim the fragments of a life once believed to be perfect. And as the light of a new day breaks through the remnants of yesterday's storm, I know that I am ready to forge a future defined by honesty, compassion, and the quiet power of hope.